Prologues. Every editor seems to really hate prologues. A lot of authors I've, seen online, read from, they say don't write a prologue. Cut your prologue. Use a prologue as a stepping stool, but then cut it. I am not, I agree with that. A lot of prologues are really unnecessary. There's no reason to write a short story setting up your bigger, more interesting story that your readers are there for in the first place. You know? Prologues don't make any sense. And I added one to the book that I'm writing right now. And I'm going to tell you why. There can be some very interesting reasons to have a prologue in your story. One of them is, if you look at Inception, it's setting up the concept of your story. Inception starts with a prologue. You could argue that it's still first chapter because the story in that prologue really leads into cobalt engineering, pursuing the main character, and leading him into the task that they're assigning him. But it's still a prologue. It really sets up the concept of the dreams and the missions and things like that are what the story is going to explore. That's what you're going to be going through. That's the world of the story. So the prologue kind of gets the viewer, the audience, interested in the concept. It gets them acquainted with the concept before really diving headfirst into the concept and really exploring these ideas and really going deeper into that world. It's a really interesting way of using a prologue to set up the world, get people used to your stranger concepts that might not make a lot of sense at first and maybe pretty confusing. I know Inception was definitely pretty confusing, but you get acquainted with the ideas. The prologue kind of explains how things work, what normal is in this world, and it really it gets you to a point where you can understand, you're comfortable with the idea, until the inciting incident throws a wrench in all that and makes things a little more interesting. But it opens with it's a very strong opening. It really grabs the reader's attention. It's a good way of using a prologue. Another great way of using a prologue is using another movie as an example. The Lord of the Rings is awesome. I'm not going to talk about the book's prologue, okay? The book's prologue is not a good prologue. Don't use that as an example. I love the books. The Lord of the Rings is my favorite books of all time, all right? But the prologue is awful. Just don't, the first time I read the book, I skipped over the prologue. I was 13 at the time. I didn't know. But it's not a good example of a prologue. The movies have a really interesting prologue. They really set up the darker tone of the story and give you a glimpse at the world and show you how vast it is. And the most important part is the tone. It's a very dark prologue. It's war, there's corruption, and there's a lot of death. It's very historical in Middle-earth. It's very mythological, and it's very big, and it's very dark before you go into the Shire, where it's all bright and happy and fun. So it really sets up that darker tone for the rest of the story, whereas, the Shire is a much happier place, which isn't, it's very temporary. It's when we're in that comfortable zone. So it wanted to get the viewer used to that darker tone that the rest of the story is going to take on, because that's more interesting. That's really what the story is all about, is that darker tone. Another really good prologue that makes use of we're going back to books now, makes use of the pages that it uses to write the prologue, is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. It's an epic fantasy. It's got a huge world that he took 10 years of research and creating before he even started drafting the Way of Kings, which is insane. A whole decade dedicated to world building. You gotta be, you know, on something to do all of that. It's a whole lot of work. But anyway, the Way of Kings has a great prologue. I had no idea what was going on when I was reading it, and it didn't make any sense to me. And that was what was brilliant about it. It gave you a really, really small glimpse at the ancient history of Roshar, the world, and showed you kind of this really big important event, but it didn't give you any context, so you had no idea what you were reading, what you were looking at. But you could see that it was important. You can tell that it was earth-shattering because of how the characters were talking to one another, how they were describing how it's going to change everything. But it's still very, very mysterious, doesn't explain a lot at all. It also gives the scale of the story. These books are massive. Each entry, there's 4 now, each entry is at least over 1,000 pages long. They're big books, and for a reason. This shows the scale of the story. It shows how much the characters are going to go through, how huge this conflict is, and you know it just shows the massive scale of this series. That's the biggest part of the prologue, is the scale, I think. The other biggest part is the mystery of the history of Roshar, but the prologue just really sets up the scale of the conflict and shows you how big everything's going to get. And it's really, really well done in that way of showing the scale, showing how what our characters are going to have to go through, how hard things are going to get, things like that. My prologue in the book that I'm currently writing right now, which is the sequel to Fossil, which I published in February. You can go check it out on Amazon if you'd like. This prologue is sort of setting up a big power player in this story. It's going to show how much of a threat they are, how these certain characters perceive this power, and what they're going to do about it. These characters are one-offs. They're just going to be in the prologue and they're done. You'll see why. They all die. I'm spoiling the book before it's even out, but it's the prologue. No one cares. But it's gonna be a way to set up this power player in the story, kind of show you what they're capable of, how they work in the world, and what their role is. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep it in the final cut. I'm also a pantser, so most of this is just a stepping stone for me getting into that story and understanding a little more of what I want to write about. I know what I want to write about, but it's just sort of getting into that mindset of the story and immersing myself as the writer to really jump into the main plot, the main conflict, and write about the main characters, the main players. I don't know if I'm going to keep this prologue in the final cut. We'll see. Probably not. But it's a way of setting up this big power player that wasn't in the first book and jumping back into the world of Fossil. It's mostly for myself. Again, for the third time. I don't know if it's going to be in the final cut. But it's there. It has its uses. And it is interesting to me. Not all prologues are made equal. Some prologues are really stupid, really useless. There's no reason to have them. Stop writing stupid prologues. Your prologue has to have a purpose. There are really interesting ways to write a prologue. They can really hit deep and up. The montage with Ellie, it's so emotional and so well done. It didn't really need to be there, but it made the movie so much more impactful and so much more emotional. That's what prologues are supposed to do. They're supposed to add value to the story, make it more interesting, make the characters more interesting, make you want to follow them more. But most prologues are just to set up backstory, and you don't need to do that in the prologue. Just set up backstory in the main story. Add bits and pieces here and there. Make the character figure out the backstory. Things like that. Star Wars, it kind of has a prologue with the title crawl, but even that doesn't really give you enough context to really understand what's going on. The only way to understand is to just watch the movie and figure it out yourself. That's the fun part. That's what really immerses people in that galaxy far, far away. And that's what your story should do. Don't worry about backstory in your prologue. Worry about character, emotion, and impact. Because that's what stories are all about. They're all about feeling, and you want to really push that feeling in the prologue. Make the story more valuable. Don't drag it down with information. That's really what prologues are all about. They can be really interesting, really helpful, or they can be stupid wastes of space and time and pages and very frustrating to get through. Like the Lord of the Rings prologue. It's not a waste of pages. It is interesting lore wise, but it just doesn't fit good. So don't use that as an example. Use the other ones as an example. Use Brandon Sanderson. Use Christopher Nolan. Whatever. These prologues are interesting. They add value to the story, and they are impactful. So I hope you learned something. I hope you found this video interesting. I have a Substack where I post a newsletter every week. There's also a paid subscription where you can get access to these videos early and watch them before everyone else does. I'm also doing more posts on that paid subscription so you guys can sort of get a behind the scenes look of my writing. I'm going to be doing videos that are sort of like weekly updates or progress reports on my novels, especially right now that I'm writing the Fossil sequels. These next 4 weeks I'm dedicating to drafting the second book that I'm very excited about. So I hope you stick around for that. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed. Subscribe to my newsletter if you'd like. I've got my books linked down below as well. And I hope you guys have a great day. Thanks for watching. Y'all take care.